Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at a little carbine here that's unusual in a couple of ways. This looks like a rolling block, but this is actually a Whitneyville Armory production carbine, which was very similar to the rolling block, but based on a completely different patent. It is also a very rare example of a carbine purchased by and used by the Montreal City Police. And it's just kind of cool that it's a little tiny baby rolling block carbine whose bayonet is nearly as long as the barrel itself. So this started out in 1875 when the Montreal Police decided that they wanted to have an armed reserve of officers in case of riot or civil unrest. And so they went to the police council and they said, we'd like to give 50 guys revolvers. And the police council thought about it and came back and said, no, how about we give 60 guys carbines? What exactly led them to that change of plans? We don't know. But in 1875, the police council presented to the city council that, hey, we think it'd be a good idea to have this 60-man armed reserve, and we'll allocate $1,330 to it. And the city council looked at it and said, well, okay, we'll give you $1,000, and that's got to cover some electric signals between police stations, as well as carbines for this new armed reserve. So the Montreal Police subsequently, by February of 1876, gave like $1,440 to a guy named Ralph Kilby, who was a manufacturer's agent. He worked for Smith & Wesson, among others, and it would appear that he probably was also an agent for the Whitneyville Armory. Now, Whitneyville was a factory in Connecticut that kind of was an OEM manufacturer for a lot of different people. If you came up with a firearms design and a good patent, but you needed someone to actually manufacture it for you, and you couldn't convince a top-tier manufacturer like Colt to buy out or license your design, Whitneyville Armory was probably the place for you. Now, there were actually two different patents that were originally filed in the 1860s for the rolling block system, and Whitneyville ended up with one of them. Remington had the other. So from 1871 until 1881, the Whitneyville Armory manufactured what has become called the Whitney-Laidley patent model of rolling block action, and that is what the Montreal Police got. They bought 60 of these in 1876. Most of the Whitney rolling blocks were sold for export, and most of them were probably sold by Schuyler, Hartley & Graham, or Hartley & Graham, a major dealer in New York. And it appears that that is who the Montreal Police actually got these guns from by way of their agent, Mr. Kilby. The top of the barrels were engraved with this Montreal Police in quotes, and that's definitely the most distinctive feature of this specific order for the guns. Now, the barrel is blued, but pretty much all of the other metal parts are finished in the white, like the receiver and all of the breech block and hammer components here. These are carbines. They do have sling rings on them. We have Whitneyville markings here on the rear tang, Whitneyville Armory of Connecticut, and a bunch of patent dates. There is a serial number. This one's a little worn. There's a serial number on the bottom tang. The 60 guns were not in consecutive order. They range over the course of the high 6,000s and the low 7,000s. However, they were also marked on the butt plates. So each gun got its own rack number, or consecutive Montreal Police number on the top of the butt plate. And the known examples run from 18 up to 59. This is number 37. Now, this is known as a first pattern or first variant Whitney rolling block. When Remington's rolling block patent expired, Whitneyville would basically immediately copy their design, because the Remington one was the more economical to produce, the better overall design. So Whitneyville produced the Remington version, called it their improved model, and sold those for a number of years until the company ultimately ceased to exist. It was bought out in, I believe, 1888. There is no caliber marking anywhere on the Montreal guns. However, I believe they're in basically 43, they're in 43 caliber, and I believe it's the 433 Remington carbine loading, although I don't have a particularly definitive reference for that. Just for a brief bit of comparison between a first version Whitney and an actual Remington from approximately the same time period, I believe this is an 1873 production Remington rolling block, you can see a number of differences here. Pin locations, this crossbar. If we flip these over, the Remington has a crossbar on the left, the Whitney does not. Again, the screw and pin locations are slightly different between the two. The bayonets that the Montreal Police got with their Whitney rolling blocks appear to be surplus US military bayonets. They are marked US right there. That would kind of make sense if these were ultimately purchased through Hartley and Graham. Hartley and Graham would have had plenty of surplus bayonets available, and they could find the one that would fit properly. And presto, 60 is not a particularly large number of them. 60 is not enough for Whitneyville to want to manufacture a custom bayonet for a carbine, where most people probably weren't ordering bayonets for short little carbines like this. Barrel length on here is a mere 20.5 inches. Now, Canada, living up to its Canadian reputation, it appears these things were probably never fired outside of perhaps some training. So the original idea had been like a reserve in case of riot or civil disturbance. There never was such a thing in Montreal that these had to be broken out of the armory for. They were apparently used to escort prisoners who were being transported between the courthouse and the prison. They may have been used by prison guards at some point, but as far as anyone can tell, they were never actually fired in any of those roles. They were officially retired from service in about 1914. It's a little unclear, but either right before or right after the beginning of World War I. They went into storage then. They were still in storage many decades later, because there is a record that documents that in about 1960, all of the remaining ammunition was destroyed. At some point, the guns appeared to have been sold for surplus. There was a particular dealer in Canada that bought some of them from one of the Canadian jails, and they kind of just disappeared into the woodwork, with only 60 of these guns originally produced, and all of the sort of utilitarian value of a very simple, very small carbine like this. Some were apparently broken down for parts and used in repairing or rebuilding other Whitney first pattern rolling blocks. Only about a third of the original number of guns appear to have survived. So they are really extremely rare guns. In fact, there was no documentation on them at all until 1965, when an article came out in a Canadian collector's publication. Subsequent to that, they've been added to several of the books on the subject, the military rolling block rifle and so on. But it's a really cool little, cute little carbine that I thought would be fun to show you guys. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.